Okay, so let us start. So today's subject is the Paramitas. So up to now, our teachings have been mainly from the Southern school or Theravada school. And this is the form of Buddhism that exists in the southern countries of the Buddhist region in Asia. So it's countries like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, southern Vietnam. It is sometimes considered to be the original or old Buddhism, although there is debate about the word original because there were other schools, in the early years of Buddhism, which do not exist anymore. But certainly Theravada can be considered to be the oldest school around. Around 100 years before the Christian era, up to about 5th century of the Christian era, another school of Buddhism started, and that is Mahayana Buddhism. And it spread northwards from India, and it went to Tibet, China, Mongolia, Japan, Korea, and North Vietnam. So it spread northwards. So, hopefully you'll establish yourself on a path of practice. And if you follow Buddhism from Sri Lanka or Thailand, it will be Theravada Buddhism. If you follow Tibetan or Pure Land or Zen Buddhism, you'll be following Mahayana Buddhism. And so really today we'll talk about Mahayana Buddhism and its main path of practice, which is the Paramitas. Mahayana builds on from what can be called mainstream Buddhism, that is the topics that we've covered in first 5 talks. And those topics are common to all the schools. They form foundations for all the schools. And so then what happened was from around 100 years before Christian era, development happened in the understanding of Buddhism, and the deeper understanding in Buddhism came from deep meditation on the teachings. And it was seen that there is a more profound meaning to Buddha's teachings than had been realized up to then. So Mahayana scriptures represent it as a superior path of practice leading to a superior understanding. And the word Mahayana comprises of 2 parts, Maha meaning great and Yana meaning vehicle. So Mahayana is seen as the great vehicle. And so we'll look at the developments that happened in Mahayana and its central practice of Paramitas. When the training in Theravada leads to liberation, the liberation being is called an arhat. And the traditional notion of an arhat is that once he becomes awakened, he has obtained liberation from himself, and that is the end of the path for him because he has obtained liberation for himself. The practitioner of Mahayana, however, and the practitioner of Mahayana is called a Bodhisattva, on the other hand, spends many eons in samsara perfecting spiritual qualities and also in the process working for the benefit of all sentient beings, that is for all of us. In other words, although they have the spiritual capacity of liberation, they still choose to stay in samsara, first of all, perfecting their path, but also to be to be available to sentient beings as a helping hand. And eventually, the Bodhisattva does become fully awakened Buddha, but only when the teachings of the previous Buddha have disappeared from the world. So Bodhisattvas, although having high level of spiritual qualities, postpone becoming Buddhas so as to assist all sentient beings. So if I clarify the term Bodhisattva, it's used in two senses in Mahayana. It can be used in the ordinary sense, in the sense that all followers of Mahayana path can be called Bodhisattvas, because they aspire to full and perfect enlightenment of Buddha, but they do so not only for themselves, but to teach and help others to the same deliverance. So that's the ordinary meaning of Bodhisattva. And indeed, if we practice any of the Mahayana path, we would be on the Bodhisattva path. The other meaning of Bodhisattva in Mahayana is a mystical aspect of totality or of true reality, and it is personified in bodhisattvas. So, for example, we have Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who is the Bodhisattva of compassion. That Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is also referred to as Kanon or Kanji in Japan. We have Bodhisattva Manjushri, who is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And the way in which this meaning of Bodhisattva, that is the mystical aspect, relates to the first meaning, that is, all practitioners on the Bodhisattva, on the Mahayana path, is that the Bodhisattvas in the second sense have arrived at their exalted position through rigorous training. And I'll just read out what an author called Gethin says in a book called The Foundations of Mindfulness. He says, what is characteristic of the Mahayana vision of Buddhism is the view that the attainment of Arhat falls so far short of full Buddhahood that it cannot be considered as a worthy spiritual goal. Contrary to the traditional formula, which states that an Arhat has done what has to be done, in other words, has obtained liberation, he or she, in fact, has further work to do. So for the earlier tradition of Theravada, the normal route to awakening was considered the path of arhatship, and the path of Bodhisattva was the option for very few. But for Mahayana, the path of arhatship appears tainted with a residual selfishness, since it's mainly concerned with one's own liberation and lacks the motivation of the great compassion of the Bodhisattva. And ultimately, the only legitimate way of a Buddhist practice is the Bodhisattva path, that is according to Mahayana. And there is an amusing story in a Mahayana sutra. Sutra is a doctrine. So there is an amusing story in a Mahayana sutra called the Lotus Sutra to illustrate the point. In the sutra, the Buddha is preaching to an assembly that had many arhats, so liberated beings according to the Theravada or the earlier traditions of Buddhism. And he says that his teaching so far has only been a skillful means devised to take account of the difficulty of understanding the profound teaching of Mahayana, and that there is still further training to do. So this is the first time Buddha is revealing to all the arhats that what they have achieved so far, although they have obtained liberation, is only a halfway house, and that they actually have further training to do. And on hearing this, 5,000 monks, nuns, and lay people arise, salute the Buddha, and withdraw because they felt they have done all that they could do. And this explains why there is, the Theravada teaching. This is because those who withdrew believed that they had done all that was necessary. And then the Buddha explains that this Theravada teaching was taught first as a skillful means because it would have been too difficult for people to understand Mahayana teachings if they were given straight away. So it was like Theravada was a preparatory stage. And once, people had gone down that path, then they would be open to the deeper teachings. Whereas if Buddha gave the deeper teachings to start with, people would just simply end up confused. So it was like a skillful device that had been set up by the Buddha. And Buddha then explains that every Buddha has only one purpose in appearing in the world. And that purpose is to teach his own full and complete enlightenment to all beings. And that there is, in truth, only one vehicle or one way which leads towards full and perfect enlightenment, to Buddhahood, in fact. And on hearing this, the gods shout for joy. So the gods is with a small g, the people in the celestial realm, if we can put it that way, people with meritorious birth. So at this, all the gods shout for joy and announce that this is the second turning of the wheel of Dharma. So the first turning of the wheel of Dharma was the teaching of Theravada, and Mahayana is the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, further teaching of the Dharma. So the Mahayana, being the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma, is development of the earlier setting in motion of the wheel of Dharma. And when Buddha says all this, three very senior arhats who had remained, had not left, and their names were Subhuti, Mahakashyapa, and Maudgalyana, who have listened with amazement, come forward and they express their feelings. They say they're old with aching bones. So, when they say they're old with aching bones, basically it's saying that, the practice now, up to now, has taken so much effort, so much time, that they are old, they are with aching bones. And they had not thought that they would be told that further progress is necessary. But they rejoice that they will attain Buddha's full and perfect enlightenment. So that is the explanation behind Mahayana, partly in mythological terms. Now, another big difference between Mahayana and Theravada is that Buddha in Theravada is considered largely to be the historical figure that was born 2,500 years ago, discovered the way out of suffering and taught that way. Whereas in Mahayana, in addition to that meaning of Buddha, that is the historical Buddha, there is another meaning, and that meaning is Buddha actually represents the mystical aspect of totality or true reality as it is. Okay, so we can now turn to the Paramitas. Wongju, if you can put up the slide of the 6 Paramitas. Okay, so we've got the 6 Paramitas on the screen. So in Mahayana Path, it is these factors which are practiced, and I'll explain the meaning of Paramita in a minute. But the factors that are practiced are giving, as in donation, but it goes much deeper than that. So, being generous, generosity. So that's dana, paramita. The second paramita is that of practice of restraint, which is Shila Paramita. We did come across Shila in the Noble Eightfold Path as well. Shila is one of the 3 pillars that was mentioned in the Noble Eightfold Path. So the 3 pillars of the Noble Eightfold Path are Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So Shila appears in this list too, that is practice of restraint. The third paramita that is practice is that of patient endurance, called Shanti. The fourth paramita is that of energy, called Virya Paramita. Then fifth one, meditative absorption, called Dhyana Paramita. And the sixth one, wisdom, called Prajna Paramita. And I'll go through all 6 in a little bit of detail. Now, you'll sometimes see a list of 10 paramitas. And so, and the reason, and this is a list of 10 in Mahayana that I'm talking about. The reason why the list of 10 exists is because there are 4 other factors to be practiced for monks and nuns. But for lay people, these are the 6 paramitas to be practiced. So today I'll just talk in terms of the 6 paramitas. There is also a list of paramitas in Theravada school, which is slightly different from this Mahayana list. And again, as in the Noble Eightfold Path, these 6 paramitas are practiced simultaneously. It's not as if we practice, Dana Paramita, master that, then go into Shila Paramita. It's not like that at all. We practice them simultaneously, and then they feed into each other and they support each other. Now, the meaning of the word paramita, paramita is often translated as perfections. So the qualities mentioned, that of generosity or giving, that of restraint, etc., are continually refined by the practice till the qualities are perfected. Now, what does that mean? Now, in the ultimate understanding of Mahayana, there is no subject, there is no object, and there is no action. So, for example, in generosity or giving, there is no giver, there is no receiver, and there is no giving. And this is the understanding that has to open up. And this is the level to which the paramitas have to be perfected. Now, when in our ordinary conversation, in our ordinary language, we talk about a giver, a receiver, and giving, these are all conceptual thoughts, which make sense of the world to us. And, this is how we convey concepts to each other. And in that sense, it is useful. But when the ultimate meaning arises, there are no concepts, there are no thoughts. So there cannot be a subject, there cannot be an object, there cannot be an action. There is just emptiness. And when I use the word emptiness, it means empty of conceptual thought. It does not mean a black void like nothingness, because in that emptiness, everything exists. But everything exists in relation to each other, so that we cannot say that this thing exists in its own right. And hopefully you'll understand that a little bit more as we go along. So when we start the practice, we may consciously be generous and give donation, for example. So there is a giver and there is a receiver. But when we look at it this way, we may, as our path progresses, realize that even in the act of giving, there is a self-interested motivation. Quite often, these motivations are lurking underneath the surface, and the practice reveals these. So, for example, in the giving, there may be a motivation simply to acquire merit in the practice, but that is still a motivation which is tainted by consideration for I or myself. In other words, it is karma producing, and will lead to further births. By training, the quality of dana is developed to such an extent that it is spontaneous, but the spontaneity does not overlook the circumstances. It always fits the circumstance. So whatever we do always fits the circumstance. It's not done in disharmony with the circumstances as they are at present. So in other words, it is a correct natural response that arises to circumstances. For example, if we are walking alongside someone and we see somebody stumble, we naturally reach out, our hand just goes out to steady that person. Now, this happens before any consideration or thoughts have arisen, so there have been no thoughts of what is in it for me. It's just a natural reaction that arises before any conceptual thoughts have arisen. Now, just to give you some more idea of this state where there are no thought coverings, there is complete openness. So I've given an example of tennis. I play tennis, and when a ball is coming at you and you hit it, if there are thoughts that, I must hit it there, or if there are thoughts of, I must win this point, they actually interfere with the hitting. When we are playing well, at the point of hitting the ball, there is complete emptiness. There is no thought of hitting the ball. The ball is actually hit. So there is no separation between the player, the ball, the hitting. And the reason is there are no conceptual thoughts in that moment. And therefore, there is no separation between the player and the playing. The player and the playing become one. So this is what the practice opens up, and then it guides us through our daily lives. And, people who practice the arts of singing, dancing, playing a musical instrument, realize that when these arts are practiced to a very fine degree, they can only be played well when there are no conceptual thoughts covering over the activity. And it's a state that, people who practice these arts would be aware of. And, magic happens in that moment. So, and Paramita can also be translated as gone beyond. So these factors are practiced to a level that's gone beyond. So gone beyond what, one may ask? They're gone beyond the delusion of I, beyond the limits and boundaries that I place on myself, on the world, and everything around me. It is gone beyond to the true reality. That's the level to which these paramitas have to be perfected. So I'll go through each of these paramitas. I've already talked about Dana Paramita, where ultimately the giving is done without any consideration of I, where there is no consideration of what is there in it for me, where there is no consideration of self-interest, and then coupled with the other paramitas, particularly that of wisdom, a natural response arises to the circumstances. Now, for a natural response to be correct, for this paramita and for all the other paramitas as well, they have to be supported by two requirements, that of compassion and that of wisdom. These qualities are already inherent in us as human beings, and the practice actually reveals them. It is not like that we have to go out and search for these qualities. Those qualities are within us, and the practice reveals these qualities. And these qualities of compassion and wisdom guide us towards the perfection of going beyond I. And when I come to the the Prajna Paramita, I'll explain a little bit more, but they have to be practiced so that there are no conceptual thoughts covering, no conceptual thought coverings. Obviously, when we start off the practice, that does not happen, but as the practice gets refined, that's when that comes about. Now, the qualities of compassion and wisdom are so important that there are two bodhisattvas who personify those two qualities, who I've already mentioned. So Avalokiteshvara personifies the quality of compassion, and Manjushri personifies the quality of wisdom. And the quality of compassion and wisdom are important because otherwise, sometimes, we fall into empty sentimentality. For example, when there's a disaster and like earthquakes or floods, we want to help something. Over sentimentality can actually cause more harm than do good. And that's why the quality of wisdom and also that of compassion are very important. And that's why they always have to be our guides. So ultimately, dana paramita is to give away any sense of I, so that there is no separation between us and true reality. We become the true reality. I'll go on to Shila Paramita. Shila is restraint in our behavior. So we've talked about Shila, practice of Shila in the Noble Eightfold Path, where the right speech, right action, right livelihood restrain the passions. And that enables the meditative calm to open up, which in turn leads to the right seeing. Now, so Shila is the restraint of the passions. We've already talked about how energy of the passions is to be worked with in the practice. Our practice is, on the one hand, to be aware of the arising of the energy of the passions, but on the other hand, not to be carried away by that energy, to contain that energy. So we patiently bear the energy of the passions without letting it dissipate by acting out of that energy. So we learn to bear the unendurable. And why do I say we learn to bear the unendurable? Because when the passions want to go out and act out, to contain them is actually very difficult. It is very uncomfortable. It needs a lot of strength, which you build through the practice. We'd all be aware that, when we have a strong desire, it's very difficult to contain it. And here we're learning to contain it, not act out of it. And a desire that wants to act out, which through our practice we are containing, is very uncomfortable to bear. We actually feel it in the pit of our stomach, energy that's there in the pit of our stomach. And that energy has to be borne, it has to be endured. And so that leads us into Shanti Paramita, which is the patient endurance of what is unendurable. And in fact, I'll talk about Shanti Paramita and Virya Paramita together. The Virya Paramita is the giving out of energy in our practice, to sustain the energy. And the reason why I'm talking about Shanti and Virya Paramita together, the third and the fourth paramitas, is because they sustain and support the other paramitas. Without the paramitas of Shanti, that is of patient endurance, and Virya, that of energy that is required for the practice, the other paramitas do not get the sustained effort that is required to develop them. So the other paramitas would simply just fizzle out and come to nothing without us practicing Shanti and Virya paramitas. So Shanti and Virya paramitas are like powerhouses of the practice. Now, just to give an example of what I mean by the effort and the energy required in the practice, and also the endurance required in the practice, I'll give two examples. The first one is that of bodybuilding. Now, if we imagine that we embark on bodybuilding and we have a coach who is training us, and after a few months of practice, we get to a level where we can raise 30 kilos. And we feel, we put so much effort to just get to that stage that we feel now we've arrived at a point that is our capability, that we've arrived at what we can do and that we can do no more. However, if we have got a good coach, he'll encourage us to say, just try, just put a half a kilo more and see what happens. And, at first, we believe that we can't do it. We try and we can't do it. But the coach encourages us and we try and we try. And suddenly one day we do actually manage to lift that weight. And then we know we can do it. But, when we next try to do it, it's still difficult. We may not manage, but we keep on trying. And eventually, by continuously trying, that then becomes the norm. So we've broken through a self-created barrier. And this is what the Paramitas of Shanti and Virya do. They help us break through a self-defined barrier. The other example is actually a story from the Zen tradition. So in this story, there are houses built in Japan, the traditional houses. They are built of just paper and wood. And they are quite prone to catching fire. So there was an old lady who was living in one of these houses, and the house did catch fire. And in the middle of that conflagration, the old lady managed to drag out a chest containing precious family heirlooms. So next day, people gathered around to help her. And it took 2 burly firemen to lift that chest. Now, how did that lady, in the heat of the moment, if you pardon the pun, manage to drag out that chest of drawers when it took 2 burly firemen to lift that chest? We are capable of some amazing things. There is something within us that is, if it's not restrained, opens out and responds. And in the heat of the moment, this happened. And often we do find that in the heat of the moment, we too do respond similarly. Now, going on to dhyana paramita, we'll actually talk about dhyana, which is meditation, next week. In fact, the subject of next week's talk is meditation. So we'll be talking about that for the whole talk, really. Today, I will simply say this, that there are 2 aspects to meditation. The first aspect is called samatha. And in the samatha part of meditation, we develop calm. So we calm the mind, through the practice of dana, shila, shanti, virya. We manage to calm the mind so that thoughts are not worrying about in our head. And so quietness opens up. Now, the other part of meditation is vipassana. Once we are settled in samatha, during vipassana, we interpose a teaching that we do not understand, perhaps, or a passion that is causing us suffering, or something that, if there's a teacher guiding our practice, then a teacher might have told us to look into something, a teaching or a passion perhaps that we are constantly coming up against. And so what we do is in Vipassana, we put that in the quietness, and we just then let it be there without following it with our thoughts. In other words, we do not follow it intellectually, but we just let it be there. And then information eventually comes up about that issue or about that teaching, which actually opens it up. Now, it may not come about immediately in one session. It may take, maybe months of practicing for something to open up, especially if it's a very difficult teaching, or if it's a fire or a passion that is very deeply grounded in us. It may take months of practice before seeing as to what it is opens up. But that seeing opens up of its own accord if it is let to be in the quietness. And the reason why we do not follow it intellectually is because, when we have an intellectual or a rational framework, it is actually self-constraining. We have ourselves built up a rational framework through our lives, through our education, through our experience. And, it is very useful, but the other part of it is also that it limits our seeing, because anything we see, we see within that framework. We cannot see anything outside that framework, because we've defined that framework throughout our life, and that is what guides our seeing. Whereas what we need to see is something that's beyond that. So that is why if we follow, say, a teaching or a fire that we're working with through simply just intellectual seeing, it will be limited. It will be limited to our understanding that exists within our own framework, whereas we are looking to break through that. And that is why it's not ultimately followed intellectually. It opens up of its own accord in dhyana practice, in Vipassana. And the new opening up is an acquaintance then with the teaching that brings us closer to the understanding of true reality. And the new and that new understanding, we can see what we mean when we say that there is no subject, there is no object, there is no action, because there are no concepts. When we see subject, objects, action, it is because of concepts that we say it. When we go beyond concepts, none of these things exist, yet everything exists. It is sometimes described in a particular Mahayana school of Buddhism called Kigon. It's described as such that if you imagine that there is a three-dimensional net, and at each intersection of the strand in the three dimensions, at each intersection of the strands, there is a jewel. And each jewel reflects every other jewel. And so that is what actually true reality is. It is all these jewels reflecting everything else. And when something moves, it affects every other jewel. So everything is interlinked, everything is affecting everything else. So that is the true reality. And in that true reality, there is no individual separate self, because everything is linked with everything else. Everything reflects everything else, and everything else, in fact, reflects that particular jewel as well. So everything is interlinked in that sense. There is no separate I, there is no subject, there is no object, no action, no conceptual thought in that reality. Now on to the last paramita, that of prajna. Prajna paramita, or wisdom paramita, is the crown of the 6 perfections. It is the perfection of wisdom, is the penetrative, direct understanding of emptiness. And it is this penetrative, direct understanding of emptiness that transforms the other 5 paramitas, that of dana, shila, shanti, virya, and dhyana, for them to be paramitas, in other words, to have gone beyond. So without the wisdom paramita, there is no perfection of the other 5 paramitas. And sometimes it's described as, it's like firing a clay jar. The wisdom paramita is like firing a clay jar. For left unfired, the jar of the other 5 perfections are easily shattered. So a bodhisattva practices the perfection of wisdom so that he is then not easily overcome by the fires, and so in the end, it's the wisdom that is the true guide. So that is the 6 paramitas. And sorry, I just read out one other thing, which author called Peter della Santina says in a book called The Tree of Enlightenment. He says, the perfections of morality, patience, energy, and meditation, for those, it is through understanding the perfection of wisdom that one understands the purity or emptiness of the subject, object, and action present in every sphere of action. In every practice too, it is understanding the perfection of wisdom that enables one to act perfectly to achieve the perfection of generosity, the perfection of morality, and so forth. It is in this context that we need to appreciate the unique role of perfection of wisdom. In other words, perfection of wisdom is the ultimate guardian, because then, we have the wisdom to act in accordance with true reality. Okay, so with that, we can conclude today's talk. Wongdo, you can remove the slide. Okay, so I'll open the session for questions. Wongdo, you can remove the slide. Okay. Do we? Okay. Sorry, just a minute. Right. Okay. If I know that this subject is very difficult, but the reason to give you this subject is to really give you a rounded view of Buddhism so that you're aware of what Mahayana involves. And, next week I will talk about, where to go from here, because, I've been talking about that, practice is a very, very necessary part. So this course by itself is not enough. So if you want to go further, then practice is necessary. And I will talk next week as to where we go from here. And so, this today's talk will help you understand that if you're practicing Tibetan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, then you are actually practicing Mahayana Buddhism, which is at a very profound level, slightly different understanding from Theravada Buddhism. I can also perhaps give you another explanation of how it differs, which is actually, you find this in very advanced texts, but I'll try and sort of make it a little bit understandable. So, I've talked about, our practice in Theravada in the first 5 class. I've talked about how the practice should be from moment to moment. And the advanced texts actually say, and so the advanced texts from the Pali canon, the Theravada canon, actually describe what happens in every moment of consciousness. And really, various factors in our consciousness are coming together. For example, there might be a factor of desire, and that might be combined with ignorance, avidya, which leads to an unskillful action, or it might be combined with wisdom, in which case it leads to no more karma being led. So in that sense, the text describe what happens at every moment of consciousness. And, we learn to see this happening to us, that, various factors are coming in and affecting our consciousness. So at any moment, that consciousness consists of many elements of consciousness. And according to Theravada, those momentary existence of those elements of consciousness are actually there's some sort of reality behind that. So there is an element of desire, element of consciousness of desire. There is a momentary existence of that consciousness. So, in other words, it gives it a real existence, albeit a momentary existence, a passing perhaps existence. Whereas Mahayana says to think that even there is this momentary existence is not correct, because, if everything is coming in relation to everything else, how can there be something momentarily existing on its own? So because everything is affecting everything else, it is simply just something that is always in motion. There is nothing that is even existing momentarily, unlike, say, in Theravada. So that is therefore a profound view of emptiness. It is, and that is why it's called full and perfect emptiness. It goes beyond the view of emptiness in Theravada. As I say, do not worry too much if you do not understand this, but this is the ultimate explanation of how at profound level the understanding of emptiness differs in the two traditions. Okay, so if you have any questions, do raise them. Or you can put them in chat, and Wongdu will read them out if you want to. Yes, Nivedita.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you for the session. It was wonderful. Thank you. My question is, there is a lot of information on the internet regarding schools of Buddha.
Yeah.
I want to learn this complete course, not just stop here. So could you recommend any schools related to Mahayana, which you described in North?
Yeah.
Any school which I can go further and don't stop anywhere?
Yeah. So yeah, as I said, next week I'll be talking more about, where you go from here. So I'll be talking more about that subject. But if you are looking specifically for Mahayana school, then you have to look at traditions that come from Tibet, from China, Japan, Mongolia, and Korea. So here in England, what we have easily available is Tibetan Buddhism. I would guess that would be so in Canada as well, where you are. And we have Zen Buddhism fairly easily available at the society, Pure Land Buddhism as well. So those are the main schools that I can think of that you would find available in the West. Zen, Tibetan, Pure Land. Yeah? Pure Land.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure. Okay, so as I say, I will talk more about it because it's important that if you do want to practice, that, I give you some information as to where you go from here.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, right. Okay. I know.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi, Rohit.
Hi.
I got one question came through the chat, so I'll read it for you.
Yeah.
Which of the two traditions would Buddha have been most closely aligned to?
Okay, so, Buddha would not have been aligned to any particular tradition as such. As he said, there is only one way, actually. In the end, well, at least according to Mahayana, it's the full and complete enlightenment. So Buddha had, the capacity to understand the full and perfect enlightenment. In other words, the teachings of Mahayana, that is what Buddha had discovered. But Buddha did not give that teaching to start off with. He gave the teaching of Theravada because people would have been too confused if he talked about Mahayana straight away. People were, and he felt that if people were so confused that it would just be unproductive, and therefore he devised Theravada teaching to be available as perhaps a preliminary teaching, and then he went on to teach Mahayana. So if you ask, what Buddha's teaching was, what Buddha followed, it would be his own full and perfect enlightenment, which is the ultimate understanding that he had. And you can't say that he, practiced one or the other. Okay. So I think Ruchita had the hand up. Yeah. If you want to ask your question.
Sir, actually, I wanted to ask you, the first time doing this Buddhism course.
Yeah.
So actually, I couldn't understand everything, but I understood the wheel of life, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
And sir, I wanted to ask you about do we get a certificate of completion?
Say that again, sorry.
Do you get a certificate? Do we get a certificate of completion?
No, not really. It's Buddhist, Buddhist society runs this course really not to give any qualifications as such. It is really for personal interest of people to enable people to practice Buddhism. It is really, for themselves. Really, it is not as recognition of anything. Really, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, Rohit. I got one more here.
Yeah.
Should we, as a beginner, then start with the Theravada tradition, and as we understand that, then go to the more advanced, like Mahayana?
Okay, no, you don't really need to do that. And again, I'll cover that next week. The teachings of the first 5 lessons underpin all the traditions. So even if you're practicing Mahayana, though that is like assumed, it is that it underpins it. So you don't need to first have done Theravada to then go on to Mahayana. So you don't need to say practice Sri Lankan Buddhism and then go on to Tibetan Buddhism. You don't do it that way, actually. And in fact, that can cause a lot of confusion. So you should really pick one path and just stick to that. And, people are naturally drawn towards either Theravada, or they are drawn towards, say, Tibetan or to Zen. And I'll talk a little bit about, if you're not sure, what you can do to decide which path you're drawn to. But you definitely don't need to, do a Theravadan traditional practice and then go into Mahayana practice. That's not how it works. Whatever tradition you choose, you just stick to that, and that will cover that particular tradition in its entirety. Okay. Okay, so if there are no more questions, then we can say goodbye. Thank you very much for attending, especially people in England who have sacrificed watching football. Thank you for that. I'll see you all next week, where we'll talk about meditation, which is the core practice of Buddhism. So I'll see you all next week.